but just have one more important point to touch on with you, which is the much talked about rise of the middle classes. Which of course, living in India, and both of you have been traveling in India, you must have seen the at least the outer visible symbols of the rise of the middle classes, or in fact it's the upper middle class, the rise of the upper middle class in India, and say the same thing with China. One thing that we have seen is the rise of this, which is not just the upper middle class in this very bland sense, but it's a upper middle class in India which is very aggressive, which is aggressive in the sense of it's saying that, well, we have earned so much money and everything, we want services now delivered at our doorstep. We want electricity, we want water, we want good roads, we want a swanky country to move around in our swanky cars, right? So it's kind of cornering politicians, it's cornering the government, it's cornering anything that could be associated with the old public sector, right? And hence it's also supporting the neoliberal state, which is security-centric, but at the same time would, not, say, subsidize food for the poor. So there's a kind of a rollback of the welfare functions of the state, which this upper middle class supports. And it's a virulent and extreme supporter of private sector. Anything private is good. Along with this, what we have seen is that this class is also spearheading what is called the anti-corruption movement. One of the features of the anti-corruption movement is again leaderlessness. One of the features of this upper middle class movement is their hatred for politicians, which is fine because I have no problems with that. But it's also an aggressive neoliberal, pro-corporate, pro-US, anti-Muslim, casteist. You can garner all the abuses for this class. It's that kind of a class. Right? Along with that, as I was telling you, this leaderlessness, and you can even call it horizontalist movements and all of that. Like a politician will turn up at their demonstration and they will chase away. Even some of the right-wing politicians were chased away. So what's going on? You have leaderlessness, kind of horizontalist kind of movements where it's all through Facebook and Twitter. That's how they gather, in the city center. But at the same time, if you look at the character of this class, it's true that in India, this kind of upper middle class movement has not been able to bring in the poor, bring in the basic masses. It is still but still it affects them. Mm-hmm. So maybe this is a different picture from the horizontalist movements in Latin America. I was wondering, how the upper middle class thing works at all in the Latin American situation.
Well, certainly, some elements of the middle class join in these movements and make common cause with workers and peasants and trade unions, etc. But it seems to me, quite frankly, that the idea that one can develop but part of the economy, but part of the nation, and make it a modern capitalist state when the vast majority of the masses live in unsustainable poverty and exploitation is a bit naive, quite frankly. The idea that one can have development that leaves out more than half the population, if not a much greater percentage, is just not well thought out. We have seen in Latin America and elsewhere that those who come to the middle class late, who have just ascended to the middle class, can be terribly myopic and even quite reactionary. Indeed, many of them supported the coup in Chile, supported the dictatorship.
That was in 1973.
In 1973, there was a significant opposition to Chavez in Venezuela that clearly had members of the upper class, but had a substantial participation of a lot of middle-class people as well. So one has to realize that this group, particularly in its nascent stages, can be extremely reactionary.
To what extent is the anti-politician thing that we hear about? Like in Argentina, we heard that they have this slogan about, oh, politicians fuck off or something.
Well,
I was reading that.
Right.
Because in India, we also have that. But as I was telling you, the character of that movement is very different from what we have there, I think.
Well, I mean, in the traditional sense, they say, throw the rascals out, just to get rid of the...
But who are these people saying it? Because here the ones who are saying it are actually rascals themselves,
Right, they're part of it. But in Latin America, like in Argentina, when I was there, you saw these big posters that said, que se vayan todos, throw all of them out, throw all of them out, don't trust any of the politicians. So I think
it's the same thing here.
I think what happens is people see that these political leaders really are not providing the vision, the statesmanship that's really necessary.
And these are the basic classes who are saying this? This is the workers?
Well, it's the workers and even known as the middle class in Argentina. But I mean, when, groups try to foist their particular interests on a whole society and leave out a substantial part of that society, it's very difficult to have national development and national unity. And so, in essence, the corruption goes on because that's the only way politicians can stay in office or enrich themselves sufficiently. The whole vision of national development needs to be kept in mind. It is quite frankly inconceivable to me that the upper class, the upper middle class, segments of the middle class could develop into even a modern capitalist society while leaving behind the masses and the poverty. You cannot even have a mass consumption society when the vast majority of the people don't have the means to consume the very products that your national industry and national service industry can produce. So I think that whole approach has to be very carefully looked at, if not radically criticized. Certainly from a socialist perspective, but ironically even from an enlightened capitalist perspective, because you cannot have development when you leave out most of the people. And ultimately, of course, ironically, and this might benefit socialists, you will pave the way to revolution as people become more and more disenfranchised, and A, see the disparity or growing disparity, and B, look at the hubris, the arrogance of the upper classes and middle class who clearly don't care about them, who clearly just want to receive all the services that benefit them and leave out basic considerations of public health, of basic infrastructure, of decent education for the masses, of humane health care for the masses. That's I think, a very questionable way to proceed, if not a very dangerous one in many ways.
I think we've come to the end of the interview. If you have something more to add, or if you want to say something more, then you're most
well, no, I would just strongly emphasize the need for people to learn from each other's experience and understand each other's experience, and the importance of doing very concrete, specific analysis, using all the mechanism, all the intellectual apparatus that Marxism gives us, not just the writings and analysis of Karl Marx or Nicholas Lenin, V.I. Lenin, Nicholas Ulyanov, or Mao Zedong, who are all important, but to integrate thinkers like Mariategui, thinkers like Antonio Gramsci, thinkers like Rosa Luxemburg, and indeed many other people as well, and to incorporate these in such a way that you can understand this very complex new social, economic, political phenomenon that does indeed allow sectors of the bourgeoisie, transnational, globalized sectors, to emphasize a disproportionate role in development and in national decision-making, and to use, as Antonio Gramsci or Mariategui would say, to use the cultural hegemony of the press, of consumption, to sort of stultify the feelings of the masses and to create a false consciousess and false expectations that even the lower classes can somehow become part of this international consumptionist model, when in fact, until radical change is made, that will not happen.
Do you have a couple of minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah? No, you mentioned Fanon. So somehow I thought that, because I also hold Fanon very dearly, and of course, the moment you mentioned Fanon, there was an entire continent there between the Indian subcontinent and Latin America, the entire big mass there, which we simply can't ignore. And of course, one of the problems we had, I think, in our own Indian anti-imperialist movement was there's very little of, forget about Latin America, which is kind of further away, very little from Africa, and particularly Fanon is such a pertinent figure, but somehow doesn't really get mentioned here, unless of course now some of the post-colonial writers like Homi Bhabha, who engaged with Fanon, but the post-colonial engagement with Fanon is not even an engagement. I think it's an appropriation of Fanon, which really kills the revolutionary essence in Fanon and tries to reduce him to some kind of a, some culturalist critique of Eurocentrism. And that's where I think Fanon becomes very important. And one of the things, of course, if you see, is that, Fanon is writing after Gandhi. Now, Gandhi being such a big figure, he's bigger than he deserves to be that big, And when you read, say, for example, The Rage of the Earth, there is hardly any reference to Gandhi there. I think there is not a single reference, I think, to Gandhi, And I think he was some writer, was it? Someone I remember reading who says that, who makes a problem out of this fact that Fanon never refers to Gandhi, So there's this underlying assumption that we have to defer to the great man, the Mahatma, So how can you talk about anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism without a single word on this great man? So to me it looks like, in fact, in Fanon, I think Fanon was silently critiquing Gandhi, even though he never mentions Gandhi. There's no way Gandhi never crossed his mind, right? Because Fanon is a very, very agile mind. It's a very, very rich mind, right? So, and particularly given that he had such strong connections with France, there are a lot of French who were writing about Gandhi at the time. So Gandhi was discussed there in France. But what I want to ask you is, we read about these tremendous revolutionary solidarity between some of the armed struggles earlier in Latin America, including Che and Cuba, and the struggles in Angola, in Mozambique, and many other countries in Africa. So if you could maybe in a couple of minutes, we'll soon end now, in a couple of minutes, just tell us a bit about the Latin American radical movements and the African struggles.
We're always happy, those of us who study Latin America are always happy to claim Fanon, because he actually is a Latin American as well. He was from the French colonized island of Martinique, and heavily influenced, by the way, by Aimé Césaire, his mentor, who's well worth reading as well, specifically on anti-colonialism. But arguably what Fanon talks about is the need to be liberated from colonialism and indeed neocolonialism. And he realizes that the liberation is not only physical, although he does first note that the colonialism, the imperialism that was implanted in the developing areas was done, as he says, by the dint of drum and gun it was forced on the colonial people, as we've seen in India, as we saw with the conquistadores in Latin America, as we saw with the Europeans massacring thousands, if not tens of thousands of Africans to impose their rule. And he realizes that the nature of colonial rule can do the worst type of subversion because it subverts the mind. And he thinks, and perhaps here is the implicit critique of Gandhi, he thinks that violence is necessary to liberate him, and Fanon is a psychiatrist, he's a student of the mind. He thinks that violence against the colonial authorities is necessary to liberate the colonized people from this intellectual, psychological yoke that colonialism places upon them. And he thinks then that they must struggle, and this only in this way can they retake their holistic personhood, can they develop their own national culture. So that indeed is something to consider. He really, and he took this further. And indeed, this sort of, to be a bit precise, reminds me of some of the commercials I've been looking at on Indian television, where all the people who sell things to women are extremely light, almost European in their complexion, and yet that's not exactly how most Indians look. Fanon wrote another fantastic books called Black Skin, White Masks, the need to take on European appearances, even racially, and not be who you are.
That's right, that's right. No, I was also trying to, wanted you to say something about Che came and worked in Africa.
Yes, he did.
For some time, you know, and apparently he wasn't really happy with some of the African revolutionaries he met, you know, right? And what is going on there, like, you know, or did Che and Fanon ever, you know,
not
that is a very, that's like a big missing link, you know, that's Che and Fanon, but they were alive at the same time, right?
Yeah, Fanon died fairly early, though. I was trying to remember. I think he died in something like 63 or so. He got cancer. He got a very bad case of cancer.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So he may not have been able to. But certainly Guevara, you know, accepted that, and I think he had some problems with Africa. But I mean, Fanon is very clear, because even though he comes from Latin America, he writes about.
I mean, you know, you have Mao and you have Fanon, you have Che. And some of the three never really engage properly with each other, right?
No,
there's a problem somewhere, you know. And each of these guys, I think there was something.
They all had.
I mean, my instinctive feeling is that they're quite nationalist. I think at one level, even though about Che particularly, it's very difficult to say that. But somewhere they were, I think, something which I'm not very. I'm not very sure about, you know, what our great heroes were really about, you know, at this level, you know.
Right. I think they all saw part of the reality, and I think we're blessed, you know, because we can read all of them, and we can read other people. Like Amilcar Cabral, the great.
Cabral was there, and the Black Panthers movement was in the U.S.
Exactly.
I think the Black Panthers interacted with the Maoist movement. I mean, a lot of Black Panther activists did go to China. I think even during the Cultural Revolution. Right. So that, and of course during the Cultural Revolution there were these huge posters about Black liberation. So that bit seems to be there.
And as we were saying, the Cubans started to get this together with their idea of the tricontinental.
But what I don't get is that if Cuba was really that anti-imperialist, that anti-US, then how come it does not have a active solidarity with the Black Panthers movement, which is fighting the US from within the country?
Well,
you know, right?
In point of fact, they did to a degree. Keep in mind that quite a few, or at least some of the Black Panthers, hijacked aircraft and went to Cuba, and they were given exile. And keep in mind that other members of the Black Panthers got to Cuba and received exile. There's still members of the Black Panthers who are living in Cuba who were supported by, you know, the Cuban authorities and the Cuban government. So there was an understanding. There was a direct connection there. That still goes on. We can read about some of the Panthers who are still exiled there and writing and thinking and how they've assimilated the Cuban experience. But I mean, I think, you know, the point is, that to create socialism in the 21st century, we have all these rich sources, and we have great methodological sophistication. We have, tremendous facts at our fingertips, at the touch of a keystroke on the computer. And this allows very concrete analysis. And I think also that's the positive part, but one has to be very careful of exactly the sort of brainwashing that this globalized capitalism can give all of us who endeavor to understand it, but particularly the masses. And I think it's terribly important that progressive groups and progressives come up with their own story, their own explanation, their own history of the world, that explains to the common people exactly how this system works. I don't think that we as progressives can allow then the public relation experts, the spin doctors, to tell the story. I think we have to tell our own story. I think we have to tell the people's story. I think we have to allow the people to tell their own story and tell them how important their story is and how it is theirs and how they have to tell it and not be forced then to accept someone else's.